don't have the answer.
I'm curious about that. How they connect from Ukraine to Egypt and things like that. I think they even connect to interterrestrial cities in Asia. I know they connect through tunnels, but what are the lighting systems and all that like?
Everything is connected from below. Everything or practically everything. You can travel from Rome to Giza, to Busegi, to Ukraine, Crimea, to Angkor Wat, to Nazca, to Area 51, to Dulce and other dumps, without leaving the surface. There and many more places.
My goodness.
There is a subway network that covers the whole Earth from below. This is not even new.
But I'm more interested in the old tunnels, not the new ones.
It's just that the tunnels merge between the old and the new, and the reconditioned old and the abandoned old. The Earth is not hollow as such. That is false. But it does consist of huge to small cavities connected by natural networks of orifices and passageways that add to the artificial ones, creating an entire world below, with peoples and civilizations cooperating and fighting each other at times. It's an interconnected gruyere cheese. There are more things below in terms of people, inhabitants and cities, technology and nature than on the surface. The word overpopulation is false, the one on the surface, although it is not perceived that way because everyone is crowded in the big cities and in areas that are overpopulated. But that is a bad distribution caused by the controllers. And a few humans up there with their bad behavior can do a lot of damage to the ecosystem. More so if you add to that bad education and destructive values they impose on the human population that is constantly in survival and self-serving mode. So the problem is not the number of humans that must be reduced, but their destructive behavior. And those who program that this way is the cabal itself. The world is not constituted as they are told. No one buys this. No one understands it or sees it as possible, but it is the truth. Everything on which humans base themselves, from history, medicine, science, and all that it brings, is manipulated and false. For example, I started to investigate about Tartaria, and it turns out that with other names and with the same one, yes, it existed, and I understand it better now. Not completely, because it is new information for me. But yes, there are non-human records about Tartaria. And again, what this confirms to me is what we have already said, that history is manipulated. They wiped out an entire civilization, and recently, only in the mid-19th century, ending completely in 1938, although it had been in decline since the 1700s. But this is also not precise, because the times do not correspond at all, neither with Tartaria nor with the rest of the terrestrial history. What I have found is that the times do not correspond, but in a much more serious way than just those 300 years that are supposed to have been added to the Julian calendar. Everything seems to be more compact. That is to say, that the events of at least 2,000 years ago happened in much less time. I am talking about a few hundred years. Being that several characters of the history are repeated as if they were the same person that most probably were. Characters that are mostly no longer known, but who I found thanks to the fact that, investigating, I saw that other terrestrial researchers had already seen similar things, annoyingly similar between Napoleon and Hitler, and between Lincoln and JFK. While the latter do seem to have been two different people, it would seem that there is something murky between Hitler and Napoleon. Too many parallels, but I can't explain what yet. I still think they were two different people, but that their stories or history repeats what happened, just because everything is made up anyway. They repeat for lack of inventiveness or because it goes into loops. But characters that were completely erased in the history of Earth but were recorded in the historical records of the Federation or even Taygeta, characters that were recorded as historical on Earth as real, I find that they lived in different times, separated by hundreds of years, but their lives are the same. This again is seen as an example with the parallels between Jesus Christ and a long list that includes Horus and even Buddha. So even though history on Earth is considered well documented, to the extent that historians find sense and linearity and documentation, and more recently even photographs and physical evidence of all kinds to support their official history, that is, the whole gigantic mass of information and data, documents, evidence, and firm arguments in enormous quantities, corroborated by countless sources, even from other cultures that supposedly have had no contact with each other, all pointing in the same direction, which forms the evidence that sustains the historical narrative as real. Even with that in front, there are critical information holes that collapse everything. Unfortunately, such holes are mostly of non-human information, recorded by the Federation outside of Earth, although there are also information holes found on Earth. One of these larger information holes is all about Tartaria. It is assumed that the entire area of Siberia, which is huge, in the recent past was only inhabited by nomadic tribes without civilization and with little control or dominion over them by Moscow because of the sheer vastness of the distance, which made it impossible to have dominion over such vast and difficult territories. This, in my recent investigations, turns out to be completely false, being that this vast territory is mostly steppe and forest, which makes it ideal for colonization and the development of highly advanced civilizations. This is where Tartaria comes in, which, according to the evidence I have seen, covered at least from about 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers west of Moscow to the Kamchatka Peninsula, including Upper and Lower Siberia and the Balkan area as far as Kazakhstan and possibly even Afghanistan. Also including territories that today are Mongolia, Tibet, and the northern part of China. In these areas of today's Russia, there is vast evidence to this day of large cities that have been artificially erased, leaving only a few highly sophisticated buildings in the form of ruins and remaining foundations and bases of large buildings, today all covered with grassland and shepherds tending their goats. Even among the shepherds, when they come across one of these raised cities with only the foundations covered with short grass, they say that the area is called Old City, and that they know nothing about what or who was there, sometimes regarding such areas as cursed and where no one should go near them. I am not talking about one or two cities, but the remains of more than 50 large ones, that is, of several square kilometers, basically of the dimensions of modern cities, most of which are already under the ground and under grass and sediment, and erased by the sands of the Gobi, Mongolian and Chinese deserts. However, using human ground penetrating radar technology, say not with the Tolekas nose sensors, they are easily found. But since we know the rate at which nature erases a building, you can see that these cities were leveled in the artificial way. This is evidence that I see from here, and not only as what I investigated historically, but with the gravitometer and the nose radar of this ship, that there was indeed a highly sophisticated and very vast civilization in the area of Siberia and in various directions from there, what is the great mass of eastern Russia.
But when did they start to eliminate those constructions? And for what purpose? Where did the inhabitants go?
According to the evidence, and using the best data and a false time frame, it was destroyed between the 1700s and the early 20th century, with the greatest mass of destruction in the mid-19th century. Where did its inhabitants go? The evidence shows that there was a genocide.
What historical characters lived there?
Characters that have mostly disappeared from the face of the earth. They were wiped out.
Were they Mongolian or Aryan?
The evidence I have is that what you call the Mongol race was introduced there artificially and by emigration as population gaps formed as the Tartars were eliminated. These nomadic tribes of the population today called Mongolian have direct connection with 2 points as a mixture of these 2 points, China and Korea, with evidence of direct emigration from Korea.
And how advanced was that civilization?
Technologically advanced with 0-point electrical power, but lacking interstellar capability. I still can't be sure what influence they had outside of Earth. Penetrating radar indicates the presence of countless, I speak of hundreds, of pyramids and pyramid remains around the ruins of the large cities detected there, being that the greatest concentration of pyramids is found under the Gobi and northern China, where to this day there are countless ones visible to the naked eye on the surface.
But did they have the ability to defend themselves?
I still have no answer to what exactly happened to them, because the evidence I have shows that there were several wars with the West, traditional wars, where historians just changed their names and locations to fit into a narrative forced by them.
Were they white-skinned and blue-eyed?
Highly likely, yes, and of very tall stature.
Were they giants?
On Earth, historians and those who investigate Tartaria do claim that they were giants. It is very likely that they were, although not that super tall. I still don't have conclusive information on this part.
Were the Russians the one who swept those cities?
It was the Cabal, that I can tell, using historical wars like the Napoleonic ones, but lying about the places and battles. I still don't have that part well specified yet. Now look at this image. I found it on Earth, and it is what Earth researchers claim about Tartaria, but to me it is very revealing. Look at the position of the Chinese wall, cutting from the north towards Mongolia, formerly Tartaria, separating it from the south. The Chinese claim that they built it to defend themselves against invasions from the north. But look, tell me what you see wrong in the image. But note that on the right is Mongolia and Russia, and on the left is China.
I see. The area of the archers, it's aiming at China. They are defending against China. That means the wall is not of China, but of Tartaria.
Exactly. That wall is not of Chinese construction, but of the Tartars to defend themselves from China. And to make matters worse, the type of construction, design, architecture, and type of materials are the same as those found in the ruins and vestiges of the destroyed cities in Mongolia and Siberia. Another thing that I found and that calls my attention is that if you search the internet for archaeological sites in Mongolia, you find almost nothing or nothing, being that the area is riddled with sites that are still visible to whoever is there physically. Wow, Mongolia. I have fantasies about that place for years already. It is my dream to go there. Did you or Taigetans have anything to do with Mongolia? Not that I remember. My image is Steppe Eurasia. It doesn't specify more, but right there where I say, then I'm curious why I feel so much connection with Mongolia. It's like my favorite spot in the whole world. I feel very nostalgic to be there. Is there something special there? It is said that the Gobi Desert is very mystical. It may be because of deserts in general. Also, Gobi is a place with a high concentration of stones and magnetic subsoil. Therefore, it is an area of high energy in general. Compasses are useless there. They dance there. It is a problem for air navigation, at least from low altitude. Oh, okay. Curious, yes, maybe. But I feel like I've been there, like I have connection to those terrains. The Svarus haven't had anything specific in their lives related to those areas? Not that I remember. But it could be because of transfer of experiences in Sindriel Aldebaran, since the terrain is very similar, and it is also a highly mystical place. They will ask if the Svarus have traveled to the past and saw that whatever. Okay, yes, some things were seen, not all. Others were not found, most I might add. But it was said or thought before that they were not found because you don't navigate by dates. You navigate by frequencies, with frequency maps, not linear ones. It's not like you punch in a date in the navigation computer and you get there. So to find an event, you must have already made a frequency map. And if you don't have it, you have to go researching and forming your own one. So, for example, if you go to France in 1799, you will be in France with the frequency map, but you don't know what year it is. You just calculate the year as we calculate our age. And it does little good to ask someone on the streets of Paris in 1799, because people were so ignorant and unlettered that they couldn't even tell you where you are, let alone what year they live in.
That's interesting. Yes, because people don't understand that. They think that by traveling back in time and coming back, you can talk about something that happened according to them.
Although sometimes, yes, it is found, and yes, it corresponds. That event is taken as a year marker from which to base to calculate the date that corresponds to another event. But it is calculated, and ship crews have always taken it for granted that there it is. But if you question all this, you will see that it is all calculated and not solid facts, therefore prone to countless errors. Errors that ship crews do report, sand clock mostly, that by calculation they don't find what should be happening where they landed. Wow, yes, I would never have thought of that. And curious that you couldn't ask the people there what year it was. They don't know, or they answer you wrong. It could be because they really don't know, or because they are told a year that doesn't correspond to what you think it should be. Another problem is that in the past, they used other calendars that they then calculated and tried to synchronize with the Julian one. So you ask someone on the street in a city in Europe in the 1700s, and they might answer you with a number you don't understand. They moved the calendars many times, not just once. And I am talking about the Julian one, not to mention the other systems. So it all results in a confusing soup, where the outcome is that historical events do not correspond to what they tell you in the history books. I don't care how well documented they are. They don't correspond. It all seems synchronized and planted there as historical evidence to fit a narrative. Tartaria is a very good example of this. They erased that civilization because it doesn't fit or correspond to the narrative. I mean, what many say seems to be true. That is evidence of a reset of humanity. And in a very recent times, 19th and 20th century, as recent as that, less than 100 years ago. But this is all a job of going about connecting the dots, because other terrestrial researchers on Tartaria report that there was a boom or a huge number of orphans between the 1830s and 1940s. I have seen pictures of rows and rows of children in galleys. Children who they later say were given new identities, but then disappeared. They say they were melted into the general population. But this smells fishy to me, because I feel that by logic, they ended up under the earth, in tunnels, at the service of the human and non-human cabal. They look like vestiges of a strange emigration from cities and countries that simply do not exist. That is to say, Tartaria. There is very little about thousands of refugee children between 1830 and 1940. But researching, I did find some things. It's just that I didn't document everything because sometimes I don't know if it's relevant or not, since I end up connecting the dots in my mind afterwards, and I don't know where I saw what detail. Because to find something, I have to look at a huge volume of junk information and discard it with my mind. And which region was it? You mentioned above, I think, but I haven't read it yet. Europe, all of it, but with evidence that in America as well.
I heard that many trains of those children arrived in Germany. They were shipped to Antarctica. I don't know where I read it, but they were in trains with a lot of white and blonde people, and nobody knew where they were coming from. Super long convoys headed for Germany, 1940.
That fits directly with what I'm telling you. I give you the fact, big cities, the size of modern ones, destroyed in central Russia around the beginning of the 20th century, and you tell me trains full of young white people in the same time frame. The pieces fit.
It seems they didn't kill the young people. They needed them as slaves.
It seems so, yes, exactly. They disappeared underground, most likely, at least most of them, leaving out a few to cover up appearances. Map, very hard to find, of nuclear bomb test detonations in the Soviet Union. I am going somewhere with it. Connecting the dots, the detonations were not in one remote location. They were scattered all over Russia. They are called atomic tests, but they put them everywhere seemingly in disarray. Most were subterranean tests. Although it would take me longer to develop a map manually using PS with the data I have here, the location of the detonations corresponds almost perfectly with either locations with ancient dumps, entrances to the intraterrenal, or large cities of ancient Tartaria. This is alarming. Looking for data, just a second. I was researching a gentleman named Alexander Barchenko, who was involved with the Soviet Union's atomic testing on the Kola Peninsula. 2 detonations are seen on the map there on the Kola Peninsula, on my map above. After he shared what I will tell you below, he was sent to Siberia, where he was shot for high treason. I have another version that says he died there in prison. He claims that subterranean detonations were being made with bombs designed to produce downward shockwaves, and that the bombs were compressed energy, direct translation from Russian, and not atomic, and that they were to destroy an enemy of Russia hidden in deep caverns. So if Barchenko is right, we do not have to conclude that it was happening only in the Kola Peninsula, but in the whole of Tartaria, which leads me to conclude circumstantially that the survivors of extermination wars against the Tartarians went underground, where their civilization already had facilities. The correspondence of the archaeological sites, plus the sites of ancient dumps, suggests that they were not test detonations, but were indeed attacks against intraterrestrials. I can transfer the same to nuclear testing in New Mexico in the USA. simply because it is one of the points with the most non-human basis, new and old, on American soil. Which makes me think that it would not be an appropriate place for underground detonation testing. What I have found now, moving sideways a bit, is that there is fairly strong evidence in multiple documents, paintings and descriptions indicating that the inhabitants of the South Siberian region, Tartaria, were of very tall stature, 2.5 to 3 meters. However, I also have data that indicates that they were tall, but not exaggeratedly so. More like Taigetan males that are on average about 2 meters, but can reach 2.6 meters tall. One of the data comes from the descriptions of Marco Polo, who says that he was in the presence of a local sheik or king, part of Greater Tartaria, who was very tall and who offered him gold in exchange for something unspecified. There is an engraving of that, an ancient image. This map places Marco Polo right in Greater Tartaria. Now, a word of caution. While some of those researching Tartaria use this as proof that they were giants in the past, these images of Sumer should not be taken literally, because knowing the mentality of the time, an attribute or main attributes of the person they represent were captured in an engraving or image. An example of this are the people with animal heads in Egypt. So there is the very valid interpretation that the Sumerian king represented there may not have been that big or tall, but that his greatness as a king, importance or majesty, is being represented graphically with a larger size. This is important because this can be transferred to the images and engravings of Tartaria, or that have to do with Tartaria. Because I do have other circumstantial evidence, if you will, that they were of normal stature. But, important fact, they were white, blonde, or red-haired. Data that fits with the trains of children and young people which we mentioned last time. Although they may be depicting large beings, it could also be an artistic representation.
Yes, like the Chinese mummies of white, blonde, red-haired women.
Because surely they were not Chinese. Like the modern nomadic Mongols don't really belong to that region, but are the result of Chinese mixing with nomadic migrants from the Korean peninsula, who arrived there later and or mixed with the original inhabitants of Tartaria. Yes, she is clearly Caucasian. Yes, I accept that there is evidence for the existence of tall beings, giant or very tall people on Earth, because there are already too many data and objects for it not to be true. Plus, I do have records of tall humanoids living on Earth, mostly from Atlas in the Pleiades, but they rarely reached 3 meters in height. However, there are more interstellar humanomorph civilizations that have roamed this area in the recent past. Now, in more recent times, during the US occupation of Afghanistan, strong rumors were reported and spread through the networks that American soldiers had entered deep caves to fight giants. This would also support that the survivors of Tartaria were giants, ended up in caves, and Afghanistan would be to the south, but well within the expanded Tartaria area.
Yes, but I think they said that they had 6 toes and double rows of teeth.
Polydactyly. It's not uncommon. There's a whole town with that today in Spain, and they have all 6 of them working.
They said they were redheads and very wild. They would take them away with those 2-propeller helicopters.
CH-47 Chinook. There are 2 stored in the service hangar here. While this could just be internet hoax, it does have a very strong basis, or whoever did it has some pretty detailed knowledge, such as red hair. And I can assure you that such people do exist, but not officially on Earth.
2 of those helicopters in the hangar?
There is a long list of human devices in the hangar, many of them stored and inside white wrappers with tape and rotors removed, others just sitting there ready, all functional. The same ones you have there, just look alike, but have other technology. This is nothing new. This is amply documented by Salvador Freixedo in his book, They, the Invisible Owners of This World. Paper book that is in the Viera and that I want to bring here. Freixedo there denounces that many extraterrestrial races can make one of their devices look like practically anything terrestrial, including a motorcycle. His words and his choice of machine. In short, they are non-human craft, disguised as anything you want, even a John Deere tractor. Back to Tartaria. This is the point where I'm at. And more data can come in. More data is still missing. But everything points to the fact that they wiped out a very advanced civilization very recently, to the extent that there could still be survivors hiding underground. I should also say that there are mountains that are actually cities, or have cities inside, and have moving parts or large posts that guard them. This is true, and is used by many races that have or have had bases on Earth. The best known of these kinds of dumps that are shallow or no depth is the Dulce Mesa, which is hollow and has a base inside, New Mexico.
And that is an artificial mountain?
More like natural, hollowed out with rock casting technology.
And do you know what exactly is done inside the Dolce base?
Yes, it's a joint military biolaboratory between Cabal humans and Maitre. Very common. And this would explain the Russian nuclear detonations all over Tartaria.
Tartaria also had artificial mountains?
I don't know about artificial, but rather they used natural ones that they then hollowed out.
Like the ones in Turkey. I think they are also in Malta.
Cappadocia. Those are pre-flood, and they are Adamic.
Wow. They must have advanced technology there.
Yes. As I was saying, the presence of pyramids all over the area indicates the extensive use of zero-point energy.
So, Vimanas. Whose were they? From Tartaria too?
It fits in and with the Vimanas, yes?
Yes, because India also got its share of Tartaria.
Although it is known that at least some were Andromedan, or Andromedan ships, sometimes redressed according to what was in style at the time, like a Taygeta ship in Apache form today. While it could be argued that the Vimanas are much earlier than Tartaria, with what I will say as part of this topic, you will see that this is not necessarily so, as the current chronology does not fit, much less the dating. I will also explain why the time travels support that something is not right with the official chronology, and why, in spite of such travels, the dates do not correspond.